Hi guys, welcome back to Strange Recapped.
Today, I will show you a 2011 American thriller movie titled, The Good Doctor. Spoiler alert. Watch out and take care. Dr. Martin has just started his residency at a new hospital. He wakes up alongside a colleague, Dr. Page, and he starts his duty. His first duty that morning is to check up on Mr. Sanchez. Unfortunately for him, Mr. Sanchez speaks Spanish, so they aren't able to communicate fluently. He speaks with Sanchez through known sign languages and writes out a prescription. After treating his patient, he goes to the doctor's meeting at the board, meeting with Dr. Whalens. He asks Dr. Whalens about the Infectious Diseases Fellowship, and Dr. Whalens wonders why a new resident doctor will be interested in the fellowship that fast. He reassures Whalens that he wants to know the requirement, and Whalens tells him the requirement is to be a good doctor. As he finishes his discussion with Dr. Whalens, a nurse, Nurse Teresa, comes to him and asks him to read out his prescription for Mr. Sanchez. He tells her he prescribed penicillin and goes to treat another patient named Diane Nixon. He needs to take a lab test, but Teresa refuses to help him, so he takes the test himself and leaves. He returns home to arrange his new home and then goes to a bar to meet Paige, who introduces him to Christine, Dr. Carson's daughter. Upon arriving at work the next day, he checks up on Diane and tells her she has a kidney problem caused by UTI. Diane's sister Valerie and her mother, Mrs. Nixon, join the conversation. Valerie shows Martin one of her conditions, and he gets it immediately, so she calls him a good doctor. Diane's boyfriend Rich walks inside the room too, and Martin excuses himself. He meets with Teresa again, and she tells him his prescription for Sanchez was wrong. She says Sanchez is allergic to penicillin, and she will have to write a report against him. During lunch, he meets Dr. Whalens again to ask if the report will affect his career in the Infectious Disease Fellowship, and Whalens assures him it's no big deal. Upon arriving at work the next day, he walks into Diane's room and overhears her conversation with Rich. After the call, she tells him she wants to break up with Rich, but he replies her relationship is none of his concern. Teresa comes into the room to shout at him for his illegible handwriting. He goes to sort out the orders himself since Teresa can't see his handwriting. He returns to Diane, who asks if he has sorted it out. She asks about her well-being, and he tells her she is almost better. She calls him a good doctor and says she will give a good report about him to Teresa. After the doctor's briefing, Diane is released from the hospital. He visits her room and meets her father, Mr. Nixon, who appreciates him for saving their daughter. Nixon's praises excite Martin's self-esteem. To crown it up, Mr. Nixon invites him to their home for dinner. He visits the Nixons as planned, but Diane isn't at home. He eats dinner alongside Diane's siblings and parents and then asks to visit the toilet. On his way, he mistakenly opens Valerie's door. He sees her naked. He continues to the bathroom, where he sees all of Diane's medications. He enters Diane's room, picks up one of her pictures, and lies that he has a work emergency to leave their house. As he gets home, he puts Diane's picture on his family album. The next day at work, Whalens asks to see him. He asks him why he wants to be a doctor, and he explains that one of his neighbors was a doctor, and he knew how much he was respected. He says that although it is hard, he is ready to put his energy into it. He also complains to Whalens that Teresa treats him like he is nothing despite his high degree. During lunch that day, he watches Teresa play and joke with other doctors and wonders why she treats him like nothing. He receives a voice call from Diane. She tells him that her mother had prepared a gift for him the night before and he should stop by to get it. Upon arriving at the Nixon, he asks to use their toilet and then changes Diane's dosage in the bathroom. As a result, Diane falls sick again and returns to the hospital. He attends to Diane the next day. He informs her they would have to do some tests. On his way out of Diane's room, he is called for an emergency with Sanchez. He figures that penicillin wasn't Sanchez's problem as someone had messed up Sanchez's drugs. He reports this to Whalens and tells him he suspects it's Teresa's handiwork. That night, he returns to Diane's home and injects a drug into her drip. He puts the dripping injection in his pocket and attempts to sneak out. A nurse stops him. She confesses to him that she was the one who mistakenly messed up Sanchez's dosage. Before she finishes the talk, the injection has dripped on Martin's trousers. He excuses himself and goes to the toilet to dispose of the injection. For days, he continues giving Diane the wrong dosage to boost his self-esteem by treating her for a sickness he caused. One night as he goes to give her a bad drip, Teresa walks into the ward. She asks him why he is at the hospital despite not being on night duty. He lies that Diane's case was an exceptional one that he had to stay back to watch. That night, he goes to the lab to change Diane's lab specimen. The next morning during the doctor's briefing, the doctors decide that Diane has developed a strong resistance, and they have to place her on antibiotics. After which, an expert checks up on Diane. After the expert's tests, Martin goes into the ward to reassure Diane that she would be fine. She tells him that she thinks she did something that could bring back the infection. She says she has intercourse with Rich before she got admitted again. The expert calls for Martin. He asks Martin if he made any mistake or did anything that could cause the infection to spike, but Martin denies the accusation. They take Diane for MRI testing, and she returns to her ward. She asks Martin a weird question. She asks him why he didn't have a girlfriend and if he likes her sister. He denies liking Valerie. He watches Diane until she sleeps and touches her face as she sleeps. He kisses her before leaving the room. He wakes the next morning to a code 4. He runs to the surgery room and watches Diane die. Unfortunately, he has gone too far and has eventually killed her. He returns home that day dejected. As he returns to work the following day, Teresa is nice to him. She consoles him for his loss and informs him that Waylands wants to meet with him. Upon meeting with Waylands, Waylands introduces him to Dr. Sawyer, a psychiatrist, to help him with any emotional distress he may have from losing a patient. He returns to the hospital after his meeting, and Mr. Nixon comes to scream at him. Mr. Nixon accuses him of killing his daughter. Teresa is the first to support him, after which Waylands vouches that he did his best. He returns home that night. As he gets to the hospital the next day, an orderly named Jimmy engages him in a conversation. At first, Jimmy asks about the doctor-patient relationship and tells Martin that one reason he wishes to be a doctor is to make all the patients fall for him. He asks Martin to meet him in a special room. Upon getting to that room, he showed Jimmy Diane's diary, which he found when he was cleaning Diane's room. The diary consisted of all of Diane's fantasies for Martin. He threatens to disclose the diary to the authority if Martin does not provide him with hard drugs. Martin fears his career, so he gives him narcotics for the first time. After delivering the narcotics, he asks for the diary, but Jimmy refuses to return it. He realizes that Jimmy didn't have an intention to return the book. He goes home and laces narcotics with potassium cyanide. He takes the drugs to Jimmy the next morning, and Jimmy uses them. Immediately after using it, Jimmy walks behind him, requesting more hard drugs. He locks Jimmy into a storeroom and watches him die from a seizure. He calls the other doctors for an emergency after he is sure Jimmy wouldn't survive, so Jimmy dies. After the death of Jimmy, he goes into Jimmy's locker and steals the diary. The police officer comes to investigate Jimmy's death and learns from the doctors that Jimmy was a drug user. That night, Martin falls asleep while reading Diane's diary. He wakes up after the detective knocks on his door. The detective questions him about Jimmy's death and asks him if he knows anyone that can lace Jimmy's drugs. While he answers the question, he realizes that Diane's diary is on the floor. He excuses himself, takes the diary, and goes to the toilet. He tears the pages of the diary out and attempts to flush it in the bathroom. Unfortunately, the toilet clogs, and he becomes scared and sneaks out of the house. He sneaks to a beach, enters it, and contemplates killing himself. Instead, he sneaks back into his house, packs all the evidence and the sheets of the diary in the bin, then goes back to the detective holding his bag. He tells the detective he has an emergency at the hospital, so the detective leaves. Sometimes later, Martin prepares to treat a little girl who asks him if the treatment wouldn't hurt. He reassures her she will be fine and tells her he is doing better now.
Thanks for watching, guys. Subscribe to our channel.